Welcome to the Explainer. Let's jump right in. Today, we're talking about something absolutely foundational if you want to understand one of the most literally massive industries on Earth, global coal. We're going to look at this through the lens of the SASB Sustainability Accounting Standard for coal operations. Specifically, we're figuring out how on Earth we mathematically wrap our heads around the sheer, awe-inspiring physical scale of these operations, so we can actually make sense of their environmental and social impacts. So I want you to just picture the reality on the ground for a second. Imagine this massive mining equipment in action. We're talking drag lines, continuous miners, haul trucks that are literally the size of houses, and they're extracting rock and coal out of the earth at this just staggering pace. To even start assessing the sustainability of a coal entity, we've got to ground ourselves in the kinetic reality of that scale. In this sector, we don't just say tons, we measure production in millions of metric tons, or MT for short. Imagine a counter just ticking rapidly upward, constantly tracking those millions of metric tons. It's huge. And honestly, that sheer scale is exactly why we run into a major analytical challenge when we try to figure out who's actually performing well.
Right, so that challenge is what we like to call the comparison trap. Say you're looking at the disclosures for two different coal operations. Mine A reports generating this huge, mountain-sized weight of waste rock and tailings. But Mine B, they report a relatively tiny amount of total waste. On the surface, just looking at the raw data, Mine A looks terrible, right? But hold on, what if Mine A produces 100 times more coal than Mine B? Is Mine A actually doing a worse job managing waste, or are they literally just 100 times larger? Without understanding that underlying scale, those raw waste numbers are practically useless for any kind of real comparison.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is where the SASB framework steps in, with a brilliant structural fix. They use what are known as activity metrics. And basically, according to the standard, activity metrics quantify the scale of specific activities or operations by an entity. The whole point is to use them alongside other sustainability metrics to normalize the data and make it actually comparable. Honestly, these metrics are kind of the mathematical heroes of sustainability reporting. They take that raw, overwhelming scale and distill it into something we can genuinely analyze. Think of it like the ultimate denominator. To fairly evaluate sustainability, which is our numerator, so things like total water consumed or global Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, we absolutely have to divide it by the physical scale of production. That's our denominator, the activity metric. By dividing the total environmental impact by the millions of metric tons produced, boom, we get an intensity rate. It gives us that apples-to-apples comparison. It tells us how efficiently a company is actually operating, whether they run a single small underground mine or this massive global portfolio of surface mines. Let's look at how this plays out in the standard's specific rules.
Now, the SASB standard doesn't just let companies slap a generic total coal number in that denominator. No, the standard requires reporting entities to split their production scale into two very specific buckets: production of thermal coal and production of metallurgical coal. And this distinction is absolutely vital for precision. See, thermal coal is mostly burned to generate electricity, whereas metallurgical coal is a crucial ingredient for making steel. Because they have totally different end uses, face really different long-term demand scenarios, and require mining activities with completely different intensity profiles, separating them is the only way to make sure the data stays accurate and actually gives us the context we need.
And this brilliantly illustrates how it looks in practice. Entities actually have to report two distinct activity metrics, one for thermal coal and another for metallurgical coal. And notice how the unit of measure is firmly locked in at millions of metric tons, or MT. This fundamental split is literally the bedrock of the entire disclosure document. Before a company can even start telling you about, say, their labor relations or workforce health and safety or biodiversity impacts, they have to lay down this baseline scale. Now here's where we get that real aha moment of normalization. Let's jump back to our two mines from earlier, but this time, instead of looking at raw totals, we're looking at their normalized emissions per million metric tons of coal produced. Visually, the entire story flips. That massive operation, Mine A, the one with the huge total numbers, well, it turns out they might actually have highly advanced, efficient operations that capture coal seam methane. So their normalized emissions per million metric tons are actually super low. Meanwhile, that smaller Mine B, which looked great on total volume, they might be running older, really inefficient equipment, causing a massive spike in emissions per ton produced. Normalization completely cuts through the noise of scale to reveal the true operational efficiency. So the crucial takeaway here is that this single foundational measurement of scale unlocks the true comparative value of pretty much every other complex environmental and social metric in the SASB standard. Whether we're trying to figure out the percentage of water withdrawn in high-stress regions, the total weight of hazardous waste, or the impact on sites where acid rock drainage might happen, we need that activity metric denominator. It's the key that allows investors, analysts, and really all of us to properly benchmark performance, track improvements, and figure out who is genuinely leading the industry. Which really brings us to the core impact of this whole framework. When we strip away the distortion of raw size, we're left with pure operational truth. So I'll leave you with this to think about. How does establishing a standardized scale completely change our ability to hold these massive industrial operations accountable? When every single entity, no matter how big or small, has to report their impacts per million metric tons, transparency stops being a guessing game and becomes an exact science. Thanks for handing me for this explainer, and keep looking for the scale behind the story.